Hi, everybody. My name is Tim Park, and thank you for coming to the Social Science Department's 9/11 conversation. How did 9/11 change America? We've got a group of highly educated individuals to help us with the conversation and give you some thoughts of where we were during 9/11 and how it's changed America in this faculty roundtable. Again, I'm Tim Park. I'm a professor of management here at TCC for over 15 years. First as an adjunct and a full-time Connect instructor. Before that, I managed sales and marketing groups for a large international company where I learned what it meant to be an effective manager. My motto is, you don't get what you don't ask for, and you should not receive what you don't earn. And I make sure that my students are able to voice their request competently in my business communication classes, intro to business class, human relations class, and project management occasionally and things like that. I enjoy helping students achieve their goals, traveling and fixing things, because I just can't stand to pay somebody money when I can do something myself if I had the time to do it. Well, I guess that's me. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending. If you'll please mute your mics and turn your cameras off just to make sure that we don't get interrupted. And of course, use the chat for any questions that you might have. Our next panelist is Richard Miller. He's an instructor of art here at TCC Connect. Richard was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and is the first in his family to attend college, receiving a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in printmaking from the Maryland Institute College of Art. From there, he continued his studies, earning a Master's of Fine Arts degree from TCU. While at TCU, he spent 2 years at the Modern Art Museum in Fort Worth, later moving on to the Amon Carter Museum, one of my favorite museums, as long as also the Modern Art Museum I love too. He was there for over 14 years and worked in the publications department. While at the Carter, Professor Miller began his teaching career, which now spans 30 years in both art history and studio disciplines. In recent years, Richard has been involved in numerous juried and group exhibitions, collaborative projects, as well as mounting 2 major solo exhibitions. He was one of 34 artists selected from over 650 entries into the prestigious Art of the Metroplex juried exhibit held in Fort Worth. He was also one of 5 finalists for the DFW Art Awards Abstract Artist of the Year. Professor Miller is an active participant in the DFW art community and is a member of the Texas Art Coalition, the Texas Visual Arts Associations, and the Visual Art Society of Texas, as in Professor Miller is a busy man. Next is Angela Thurman. Professor Thurman teaches economics at TCC Connect and is currently serving as the Faculty Association President for the 21-22 academic year, a position which I held, and I appreciate her doing that. This is also, she's also the department chair over economics, kinesiology, and natural science, to name a few. She's received her MS in economics from UNT and her BBA in finance from Texas A&M University, College Station. Angela came to teach following a successful career in sales, which gives her a business mindset that she brings to her classroom. She has been teaching in the community college level for several years and considers teaching to be one of her many passions, which I would have to agree with. She lives in Fort Worth with her husband and loves following the exploits and antics of her 3 mostly grown children. She enjoys traveling in her spare time when she's not taping new videos and podcasts for her classes. Rebekah Pointer Adderley. Professor Adderley is an associate professor of speech and the chair of the Communications Arts Department at the TCC Connect campus. Rebekah began teaching in the fall of 2005 and began teaching with TCC in the fall of 2008. She has a bachelor's degree in communication studies from North Texas a graduate certificate in secondary education from the University of North Texas, a Master of Arts degree in communication from the University of Texas at Arlington, a graduate certificate in multicultural women's gender studies from Texas Women's University, and is currently a doctoral candidate for education, curriculum, and organizational change with Baylor University. When she's not teaching or learning, Rebekah enjoys eating tacos, binge watching her favorite Netflix shows, and spending time with her family. Okay, now we have some somber things to think about. One day, New York City looked like what was on the left. And the next day, New York City had this happen to it. And this was heard around the world. And it was something that it changed us all. One thing that I have to remind myself is, as of 2 years ago, incoming freshmen were born before 9/11, which, makes me feel old because I know exactly what I was doing that day. And it also is one of the reasons why we're doing this today, is to have this conversation to help people understand what we lived through and how it changed us forever. So let's jump into the questions for our panelists. I remember my parents saying they knew exactly where they were when President Kennedy was killed. I remembered where I was during the attacks. What were you doing when you heard about 9/11? Anybody like to jump in on that one, panelists?
Well, for me, I was actually in our Tuesday meeting in the boardroom at the Amon Carter Museum, which is a museum of American art, when all of this started to happen. And I remember right prior to the meeting, we actually, in one of the adjacent offices, one of our staff was on the telephone live with someone in one of the towers talking to them. And that person basically was asking us what is going on, because they had no clue of what was going on. And eventually we rolled the TV in and to the boardroom. So as we are having our meeting, basically we were planning, we were just a couple of weeks short of our reopening. We just had a major renovation expansion. We'd been closed for a year. And so we were planning all that. And so it was an odd moment, being sort of split between what suddenly seemed the mundane of talking about museum business and watching this on TV.
Yeah, I was in a hotel room. I just got back from a job interview, and I was looking at the TV and saw it unfold, I guess, just like you did in the boardroom. And I immediately tried to call my wife, and all the lines were busy. It was just surreal. I remember, thank God I didn't fly to this interview. I was driving home, and I looked up into the sky, and this was in North Carolina, which, big blue sky, and there were no contrails. There were nothing flying in the air, except I do remember seeing a couple of fighter jets fly by, I guess, going up the coast. But that was something that lasted for over a week. There were no flights. Does anybody else have anything that they remembered during the day they want to share?
I do remember I had dropped my daughter off at kindergarten, and my next door neighbor called and said, "Turn on the TV. You're not going to believe it." And I was horrified. And then, of course, everyone was going down to get their kids because nobody knew if there was going to be another attack, if they were going to start attacking the schools. You know, everybody felt so vulnerable. And I think everybody just wanted to have their family right there in front of them. I mean, it was really, I guess, shocking and horrifying that could happen on U.S. soil.
Absolutely. And forever we were changed, and we'll talk more about that. Rebekah, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I was a sophomore in college at the time, and I was actually headed to a funeral. It was already a really sad day. And as I was getting ready, I was watching the news, and it initially just looked like a weird plane crash. And it was just like, wow, a plane crashed into a building. But that was before smartphones. That was before social media. That was before a lot of the things that people have access to today in terms of computer mediated communication. So between the time that I left home, went to the funeral, came back home, it was a completely different story. And it just it makes me think about how much differently we receive news today than we did back then. Because if you weren't plugged into your TV watching step by step, you would not have known how the events unfolded. For me, it started out seeing a plane crash and then getting back home and seeing everything that had happened since that time. Students who are, listening, you think about the technology that you have access to. You get news alerts on your phone or your device. You can watch the news, on multiple devices. But back then, it was just the news. You couldn't pull things up on your phone. We weren't so digital. And so it was just amazing to me just to see how things unfolded. And it was just a complete shock. And just the way that we received information. I mean, again, if this was today, you'd have people live streaming things on social media. You'd have, multiple ways that people can receive that information. But I felt like I was kind of limited as I reflect. The limited ways that I was able to receive information definitely impacted what I understood at the time. And then later on to see the full everything unfold the way that it did, it was just completely shocking because I don't think anybody ever thought that would happen in America. We kind of had this false sense of security before that point. And then that happened, and it was just a complete shock. I'll say that.
Right. And you bring up a great point. It's kind of nice interlude here. How did the attack begin on American shores and affect the nation? Mr. Miller?
Well, I think, Rebekah pointed out something that was that, not since the War of 1812 had America ever been attacked on its shores. And Pearl Harbor, actually, that was an island out in the Pacific Ocean that most people never had heard of at that point. But and growing up in Baltimore, and spending my youth going down to Fort McHenry and actually seeing the large size flag flying over that fort, but understanding that it wasn't since then, and we had this false sense of these things don't happen here. I know it sounds bad, but it's like we watch these things on television happening elsewhere, and that was a revelation for people. It wasn't something that even from their parents or their grandparents that there was no frame of reference. That realization that this is different. Yeah.
Right. And you bring up a great point. We had no frame of reference. We tended to think of ourselves as this country that was insulated from terrorist attacks. Terrorist attacks happened somewhere else, not on American soil. And that day definitely changed. us all to think in a different light. Okay, next question. I remember seeing this on the news later that day. This is President Bush reading to, I don't know, a third grade class or something. And one of the students said, asked the question, President Bush received a lot of criticism for his reaction during the attacks. Was it fair? And what was he supposed to do in that moment? If you go to the next slide, you can actually see someone telling him that there's something has happened, and they didn't know any more than we did at the time. There was a plane that hit the Trade Center, and then it unfolded that there were other planes, other places. So, Rebekah, what do you think about the criticism?
Well, one of the things that we talk about in communication studies is the concept of nonverbal communication, and we teach that nonverbal communication is ambiguous. And so when you look at someone's nonverbals, you're perceiving their actions based on what you know at the time and what you think they should do based off of what you know about the situation. But when you look at someone else's nonverbals and you assess whether or not they are accurate or inaccurate or effective, ineffective, appropriate, inappropriate, again, you have limited information and you may not consider the whole picture and the way that cultural, situational, chronological, and relational context may factor into that situation. So we have to consider his setting. He was at the time surrounded by children. He was just delivered very, very shocking information. And so his kinesics, also known as body language, they were very controlled because he had to maintain a sense of calm. But also we look at things like oculesics, which is eye behavior. And I want to say that this was a video as well. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like they had maybe a video of this happening as well. And I know that the eye behavior, I saw what I perceived to be a look of shock in his eyes, but I think externally he was trying to keep it together so that he could make a quick exit, a quick but calm exit so that he wouldn't frighten anyone. But I'm sure once he left that setting and went to, some other setting, I'm sure we'd probably see a different set of nonverbal behaviors. But I would say a lot of people thought that his reaction, they thought negatively about his reaction. They thought he didn't react appropriately, but I don't think they were considering the whole picture. He was, again, surrounded by children. He probably was in shock, and he probably needed to just get out of there and assess the situation so that he could, take the appropriate action.
Right. And I think that's true. He was in a, reading a book to a bunch of, third graders, something like that. So definitely, he's not going to throw the book up and, run out the door. And I kind of thought this was unfair, this criticism, as far as how I reacted initially, because, of a situation, you bring up a lot of great points about the communication style and what could he do at the time. So, Mr. Miller, do you have any other thoughts on this?
Well, one thing too that we know, and that slide that you got up is a great one for this, but you had the press there, and as Rebekah said, actually was being videoed, as well as having the press corps there that just traveled with him. They thought this was going to be just kind of a sleepy trip down to Florida, but the protocol for the President of the United States, what this gentleman is doing, interrupting him, is an absolute never, ever happens. You never interrupt the president in a situation like this. So that the press corps, even before they knew what was going on specifically, they knew something major had just happened because of what you're seeing in that slide right there.
Yeah, that's a good point too. You usually don't interrupt the president when he's having some kind of conversation with the third graders. Okay, good points, everybody. Americans were encouraged to continue engaging in the economy following the attacks. keep on buying stuff. I remember freedom fries and all that kind of stuff. The thought was, don't let them tank our economy. Why was this a concern, and what exactly were Americans supposed to do? I think we should ask our economists this, Angela.
Yeah, and you nailed it right there. A lot of what the attack was meant to do, people from these countries, they have this hatred of capitalism, and that's what they're trying to destroy. So they're basically trying to destroy our way of life. So the way to keep that from happening is simply to maintain and to go on. So by continuing our daily lives, continuing to spend money, the economy keeps on going, and people don't lose their jobs, the GDP continues to grow, and we are able to rebuild. So it's an interesting but sort of little thought of fact that war is actually good for the economy. And that's kind of a dirty little secret that people don't like to think about. But when you have to rebuild, when you have to build any type of artillery, any type of government or military outlay, all of that is good for the economy. So it's sort of ironic that I think what they were trying to do is to destroy America, but in my opinion, I think that they made us even stronger and more united.
Yeah, I would definitely say more united, and just the heart-wrenching reality of all this. I mean, on the drive home, I could not fathom what the people in New York are going through, and it crossed my mind, well, maybe I should just drive up to New York and help out, as whatever I can do. And then I thought, okay, well, I need to go home and take care of my kids and wife, or vice versa. But it was people didn't know what to do, whether they should, just kind of hide in place. And then we really started thinking about, okay, well, we're not going to let the terrorists win. We're going to continue as usual. The only thing that really stopped was air travel. I mean, for obvious reasons, because we didn't know how many more planes would be used, basically as bombs. So until we got over that and how that changed travel forever, it was a weird time. Okay, next question. In the aftermath of 9/11, how did Americans view other countries or cultures change? How did we change our views? Rebekah?
Yes. So, and with communication studies, some of the things that we look at in terms of intercultural communication, we look at, of course, perception, and we also look at things like stereotypes and concepts like xenophobia. And so the one of the changes that happened was a change in public perception, and an academic research journal entitled Public Opinion Quarterly is one of many publications that produce research about how American perceptions of Muslims, South Asians in general changed after 9/11. You can also find information about this public shift in perception about Muslims and other South Asian communities, on the SALT.org website. SALT stands for South Asian Americans Leading Together. It's an advocacy organization. It fights for racial justice and structural change for South Asian Americans. So shortly after 9/11, President Bush urged Americans not to view our Muslim and Arab friends, both domestic and abroad, as enemies. He said that no one should be treated differently or singled out because of their faith or religion. But unfortunately, in the aftermath of 9/11, our nation experienced a rise in negative stereotypes and negative perceptions about Muslims. There was a rise in xenophobia, Islamophobia, and hate crimes against South Asians in general. And so there were many people who made this broad association between Islam and terrorism, and we experienced increased media coverage with negative stereotypes and misinformation about the Muslim community, and public opinion polls during that time and after that time reflected the anti-Muslim and anti-Arabic sentiment as well. So many Americans of South Asian descent experienced violence, verbal attacks, job discrimination, and more. And post 9/11, we really just realized the extent to which Americans had a very low understanding of Islam and South Asian cultures and religions in general. For example, members of the Sikh community were targets of hate crimes as well, and Sikhs are not Muslim, but people just kind of lumped all of them together. According to the FBI, their hate crime reporting data in the year 2000, before 9/11 happened, there were 48 anti-Muslim hate crimes reported, but in 2001, that number jumped to 481. And these are just the ones that were reported. So when thinking about how 9/11 impacted the way we viewed members of other culture groups, especially South Asians and South Asian Americans, we definitely saw a dramatic increase of negative stereotyping. Public opinion about this group in general was very low, and there were a lot of false stereotypes and misinformation and violence that people of those communities experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, one of my good friends is Hindu, and he said, Tim, I don't tell anybody I'm Hindu anymore because for some weird reason they think that I'm Islamic or something. I'm like, what? But it was a weird time. We didn't know who to trust. We didn't know who were our allies, and we did stupid things and thought stupid things until we finally figured out, okay, just because someone is wearing Habib or a turban does not make them our enemy. And I mean that took some time for us to understand. But to put this in kind of numbers, I really didn't know Islam was as big of a faith as it is. So just to give you some idea with rough numbers, and I don't know if these are absolutely true, but Christianity, 2020, there's about 2.4 billion people that follow the Christian faith or say they're Christians. Islam, there's 1.9 billion. So there's almost as many people that follow Islam as Christians. And then there's 1.1 billion people that say they're non-religious, and there's 1.1 billion people that say they're Hindu, and 500 million people that say they're Buddhist, and so on and so forth. So I had not really thought about other world religions being a Christian in the U.S. I didn't know where my closest mosque was until this happened, and until my friend said, I'm Hindu, but I don't tell anybody. It was eye-opening, and for the best for us as a nation to understand there are other religions and other creeds in the world. So, all right, next slide. How can we determine the economic cost of the nation for the nation of with the attacks? What was the economic cost? So again, broad numbers here, and I should have actually read this. So I'm reading a Investopedia blurb that I found a couple of weeks ago, and I really kind of should have started off with this just to set the stage. The New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, did not open for trading on Tuesday morning, September the 11th, 2001, as terrorists attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. First, American Airline Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. And the United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower at 9 a.m. The towers were just a few blocks from Wall Street. Of course, that precipitated Wall Street not opening. Then later in the morning, a passenger jet crashed into the Pentagon, and a fourth hijacked jet was bound for Washington, D.C., but was brought down by the passengers in Shanksville, PA. And one thing that I kind of, I haven't forgotten, but it should have clicked is, who knows what would have happened if those passengers hadn't have revolted and sacrificed their lives. I'm sure that plane would have gone into the White House or someplace else in DC, and it would have been horrific. But the 3,000 deaths that the Trade Center represented sent a ripple effect throughout the markets. And just on September 11th, there was a 1.4 trillion loss in market value in the stock exchange. And now that I've kind of ponied that up, I'll let our economist talk more about it.
Thank you for that background. It's difficult to determine the exact economic cost just because there's so many spillover costs. I mean, one cost leads to another cost, which leads to another cost. So not only did we actually have the cost of cleaning up New York, but then you also have to think about the cost of the opportunity cost of things that people did not do. So people were not going out to eat. They were not going to Broadway. They weren't going out at all. So there was a lot of money lost. If that money is not spent, then those businesses go out of business. If those businesses go out of business, then the landlords who hold those buildings, they start to lose money. So it's a ripple effect. And then you sort of scan out and you say, okay, what else are we not doing? Well, we're not taking air travel. Well, that's a direct hit to the airlines. And then you think, well, they've got a lot of money, they can handle it. Well, the airline is made up of a lot of employees. So then what do they have to do? They have to start laying people off. And then the cost of fuel goes up. I mean, it's just a ripple, one right after the next. So the economic costs were immense. They were really huge. So there's really no way to put an accurate number on what the cost was. However, the fact that there were so many people involved in rebuilding and sort of retooling a lot of the industry, the airline industry and the shipping industry, things that were designed to fail proof so that this type of thing would be very difficult to happen again. That sort of allowed new businesses to take root, and businesses that were very nimble were able to do very well in the time of rebuilding. So there was a huge economic cost, but at the same time, every time something is torn down, it allows something else to be rebuilt.
Thank you. And that's another segue to our next slide. A student went to the 9/11 Museum in New York, and it was educational, but horrible. And they saw things that they had never seen or understood. And they would like us to discuss how the museum memorial was designed. And I believe, Richard, can you comment on that?
Well, in the design, so let's draw a comparison to, and I'll explain why this is relevant, to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. that was created 2 decades prior, designed by artist-designer Maya Lin, who was, at that time, she was an Asian American, took all sorts of flack for being an Asian American and designing being the designer of that memorial. But at that competition that they had for it, there were some 1,400 and just under 1,500 submissions for it. Well, then flash forward 20 years, they selected Maya Lin to be the chairperson of this upcoming committee for the design of this memorial, knowing that she understood from the inside what all was going to be involved in selecting such a design. Because for the Vietnam Memorial, there was all kinds of controversy. People had issues with the design. People had issues with the design of the 9/11 Memorial. But one of the common threads, and you can kind of see it in the slide, and we've started to see this more and more in memorials, that memorials recognize, honor the individuals, and rather than political ideas, ideals, whatever, that you have the names of the individuals. Ironically, one of the controversial points is you had people wanting businesses to be recognized by name there, but they kept it to the individuals. For me, going up there 4 years ago, and we're going to be up there again in November, but the engine companies and those firefighters who lost their lives, and I come from a fire department family. My brother and sister-in-law, who are both firemen, went up to assist with the cleanup and rescue operations. That when you see the names, that just, it puts it on the human level. Okay, you don't have to understand or know anything about the history to understand the human measure when you look at this memorial.
Thank you. Well said. Yeah, I was there probably a year before the museum was finished, but they had the what's pictured in this picture. They had I don't know if they call it the waterfall or whatever the heck it is, but it was finished, and I remember standing there reading names. I had a tangential friend that was killed, and I found her name, and needless to say, that was a tough time. Next question, please. How did the experience of military members and military families differ from other Americans in the aftermath of 9/11? That's a big question. I believe that Richard and Angela have some input on this one. Richard?
Well, Angela, you go first, because I think you have more direct connection to this. I'll follow up.
Okay. So yeah, I am a military brat, which basically means that my dad was career military. We have a lot of military ties in our family. I went to Texas A&M. My brother was in the Corps, works in military contracting. So he is in and out of bases all the time as well. So I think that anybody that is associated with the military definitely is more affected by this, because they see the danger that exists on a daily basis. Anybody that has been in military families knows there's that deep-rooted fear of the knock on the door, in the middle of the night or in the morning, someone coming and they're carrying the flag and they're dressed in a military uniform. That's always bad news. So I think that the military at one time, they're obviously very proud of what they do. They put their lives on the line every single day for the right of other Americans to do things like burn the flag and protest and, engage in whatever kind of hateful nonsense they want to engage in. It's the military people that are out there dying every day for that. but at the same time, that's what they signed up for. So I think that it was also very gratifying to have people sort of re-embrace patriotism, and part of that is embracing the military. So I think that as a result of that, it felt like America sort of got back behind the military again. So there's been a lot of times in the past. My dad was in Vietnam, and he still doesn't like to talk about it. The public was very harsh in the treatment of people coming back from Vietnam, and this was a different experience where it felt like the public was really behind the military, embracing the military, and appreciating what military families go through, not just the people that go off and fight, but the families that stay behind and hold down the fort. So I think that it was positive for the military families.
So I guess the flip side, the difference in experience between military families and other Americans, that in reality for the last 20 years, if you didn't watch the news, you wouldn't know that there was anything going on overseas that American military is involved in. Because unlike, my father was in World War II. Okay, I know all about the sacrifices, rationing, and giving up things or whatever. There really wasn't, other than maybe the initial inconveniences. We haven't had to deal with a whole lot of inconveniences, whether that's good or bad. And so I think that's a huge difference. I have two sons, essentially. One is an adopted son who is over there right now as we're sitting here. But I remember that day after I got home from the museum, my first son was 5 days short of turning 5. And I was angry because it brought back memories of as a 6-year-old starting first grade and my brother heading off to Vietnam, and seeing things repeat themselves. And so, I think in terms of what you were saying about, that initially that surge in patriotism, in recent years, we've seen the other side of patriotism, which is nationalism, which can take countries down dark roads. So, we're kind of at a crossroads in that respect at this point.
Thank you. Good points. Okay, the last bonus question. Here's the big one. How has our nation changed since 9/11? Well, we've been talking about that for the last 45 minutes, and we need to wrap things up here pretty quickly. So I'll add this, and I had alluded to it before. Travel has changed forever. I remember just getting on a plane and not having to be frisked. And I got on a plane the week after flights opened back up again, and they literally, I almost had to take all my clothes off basically, because we were just so focused on security when planes started flying again, that it was the wait was terrible, and it was horrific at the airport that week. But I had to fly, and now we've become more tainted, I think, when it comes to travel and worrying about airplanes and things like that, which we should have been more on guard to begin with. But hindsight, of course, is 2020. That was the big change for me. Other than everything else that happened, just me personally, was looking up and not seeing contrails in the sky for 2 weeks was just surreal. Anybody else want to add to that?
I'll chime in. I actually think it made New York more friendly. My daughter lived in New York, and they used to have the stereotype of being pretty chilly to people not from New York. And I think it changed New York. I think New York realized that they were part of the United States, not just hanging out on the East Coast. And I feel like New York is a much friendlier place to be now. So I don't know, maybe people feel more connected now, which is a good thing.
Rebekah?
Yeah, I'll chime in and say that I read an article recently about how travel has changed since 9/11, and it was almost just kind of bizarre to me to think about all the things that were not being done pre 9/11. Things like people could just go into the cockpit and kind of like take their kids into the cockpit and look around and talk to the captain and all that kind of stuff. And it was just weird. Now cockpits are locked and the pilots are, armed. The cockpits are locked and bulletproof. People can't just walk in there anymore. Also things just like the TSA. I believe the TSA was established the November following 9/11. Which is, it's so weird because every time I fly, the TSA is such a big part of the process. And so just to imagine, I didn't fly that much before 9/11. So I don't really recall what my experience was like before 9/11, but I just know post 9/11, I've done quite a bit of flying, and I couldn't imagine going into an airport and, getting on an airplane without TSA. And even things like verifying IDs, apparently pre 9/11, you could do like a check your bag, and they didn't have to necessarily verify IDs at certain points. The person who checked the bag didn't necessarily have to be the person on the ID, or this really, really lax rules and procedures that I was reading about that now that would never, ever happen in an airport. So it's definitely, there's so many rules and policies and procedures that we have to follow now that just were not being enforced before that time.
Absolutely. We are, Richard, we're out of time.
Okay.
You have to be the taskmaster, sorry. Everyone, thank you for being here. I hope that our round table conversation has given you some food for thought and teed you up for some of the other conversations that we're going to have this week. On the 7th, it's 6 p.m., it's changes in government and politics. On the 8th, it's stories of 9/11. The 9th, airlines, we already kind of teed that up. Scientific advancements and 9/11 is at 7 p.m. on the 9th. And of course, on the 10th, it's discarded shoes, history and memory, which is, I'm sure will be great. So the one thing that I want you to do is please, thank you for attending. And if you look in the chat, you'll see that there is a link to get credit for attending if you're a student. If you'll click that link, fill out the form. If your instructor is offering credit for being here, you'll get that credit as due. And thank you so much for being a part of it. And please take time to think of those that we've lost and be a positive change in your world every day. Thank you.